Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. President Vladimir Putin has raised concerns about an escalation of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Earlier this week, the Russian president ordered partial mobilization of troops. The exercise to call 300,000 conscripts for war duty is Russia's first such exercise since the Second World War. The move has likely been triggered by Ukraine's powerful counter-offensive and setbacks for Russian military in EAM and Kupiansk. At least 4 areas of Ukraine controlled by Russian-backed separatists have started a referendum, which is being seen as a precursor to Russian annexation. At the UNGA, President Zelensky said that Russia should be punished for the war against Ukraine, and President Biden said Putin had shamelessly violated the UN Charter. Speaking at a UNSC meeting on Ukraine, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar said that the future outlook of the war appears even more disturbing, and the nuclear issue is a particular anxiety. Let's go across to Ambassador Pankaj Saran, India's former ambassador to Russia, and also the Deputy National Security Advisor. Ambassador Saran, thank you very much for joining us. How worried would you?
It presents a whole thesis about what he thinks has gone on for the last few weeks and months. And he has also announced these steps that he's taking. And the results of the referendum will come out in the next few days. And I don't think there's any surprise that they will all vote in favor of joining the Russian Federation. And once that happens, they will, in the eyes of the Russians, become a part of Russian territory. And therefore, any attack on those territories would legally, in the eyes of the Russians, constitute an attack on Russia. So I think definitely we are up the escalatory ladder.
We're up the escalatory ladder. Do you also feel that Putin is creating ground for attack on NATO-controlled territories as well, with the referendum that is on and has begun?
I don't think so. I think his objective from the beginning was basically, and that was the root of the conflict. I mean, apart from the security aspects, the root of the conflict actually has been the situation in the Donbas region, which is these 2 republics plus the other 2 areas where the referendum is taking place. So he was really not interested in capturing or taking over the entire territory of the country of Ukraine. And this was the genesis of the whole conflict going back to 2014. So I don't think he is looking for a war with NATO. But what he did say, for example, in his speech, is that Western military and intelligence assets have now come within a few kilometers of his own border, the Russian border. And, you know, he referred to a couple of regions in Russia which were actually the scenes of huge battles with the Nazi Germany in the Second World War. So the Western proximity to Russia's borders has grown, not in terms of troops on the ground, but in terms of military assets, intelligence assets, tech assets, satellites, etc. So I don't think he's interested in a war with NATO, but at the same time, he is preparing in case it escalates to that level.
Right. At the same time, Ambassador Saran, here you have a dictator who wants to protect his pride and who will always defend his decision. He will never show failure to his own people. That's why possibly they have ordered mobilization for the first time since the Second World War, called 300,000 conscripts. That exercise has also begun. Do you think there is a risk of desperate acts from the Russian government, considering the Western support to Ukraine will continue, this war is going to continue? If the Ukraine counteroffensive is stronger, then Putin will also hit back in some way or the other?
No, I think a lot of it, the answers to your questions are going to depend on how the NATO and Ukraine and the Europeans respond, because it is still time to stop all this madness. And everyone knows, the Europeans know, the Ukrainians know, the Americans know what kind of a solution is possible. And you had those solutions in 2014. The only thing is they were not implemented, they were imperfect, but everyone knows what the issues are. And in 2014, when you did Minsk and the Normandy format, etc., the West and the Ukrainians acknowledged that, yes, we acknowledged that there was a Russian stake and an interest. So So I think a lot of this is going to depend on how the other side is now going to respond, because you can still call a halt to this if you, for example, get into some kind of a negotiation, you take any hint or any indication you're getting from either side. And really, I think this is actually the time when the major powers really need to show the world that they care for international peace and stability. Otherwise, you cannot actually proceed along this path with your eyes shut, because it will lead to unforeseen consequences.
Right. Ambassador Saran, also weigh in on the recent meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin and Subramaniam Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister's latest speech at the UNSC, where he said the nuclear issue is particularly making India anxious, and he called on all sides to come to the negotiating table, resolve this as soon as possible because the war is taking a disturbing turn. Do you feel that India's stand is also now changing? India is more concerned about what's happening in Ukraine than probably what was happening in February or in the month of March?
I think so. I mean, I think when it began in February itself, we were actually quite upset about the fact that a military solution was being sought. And I think all sides are complicit in the failure of diplomacy, because that is what this whole thing is all about. The Prime Minister's remarks to President Putin are important, because I think he represents the view of the vast humanity and the vast membership of the United Nations. I don't think there is any country in the world who is comfortable with what is happening. And certainly we are facing the kind of a negative fallout of this conflict, which is taking place thousands of miles away from India. And insofar as the External Affairs Minister is concerned, I think he's also reflecting something which is bothering everyone. The fact is that you have 2 or 3 belligerents out here: the NATO, the United States, Ukraine, the Europeans, and the Russians. Now, these are the biggest, the most powerful, and the richest countries in the world. So they have to actually be able to show that they have the statesmanship to come out of this kind of a ditch that they are both in. And it's all about not just European security, it's actually nothing else but the fallout of the 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union, which led to these imperfections in the borders between Russia and its successor states. And that's all that it is. And that ability to take care of each other's security concerns seems to be too much for the Europeans and the Russians. At some stage, I mean, we are all hoping that, they will have the ability to come to live with each other peacefully and like normal people. But it seems that this is elusive.
Right. Ambassador Saran, my final question. What is holding back the US, the UK, the West, and Europe from coming to some sort of consensus with Russia? And what is holding both sides of the conflict from coming to a solution or a compromise?
I think, unfortunately, this is a continuation of the Cold War mentality, where you actually are seeing security in absolute terms. And you are not able to recognize or accept that both sides have security interests. The fact of the matter is, if you look at the map of Russia, the Ukrainian border with Russia is the weakest link in the Russian Western theater. And this is where Russia's core national security interests rest. That is the history of Russia starting from the Second World War. The Ukrainians know it. And so I think that is one element of the answer to your question, that whether we are now able to think differently from the past. Insofar as Russia is concerned, I think, it feels it has been wronged, it feels that it is under siege. The fact is, if in this conflict, both sides feel they are the victims of either history or geography or circumstances, then, it's going to be difficult for them, obviously, but it's also going to be difficult for anyone who tries to enter into this dispute and tries to mediate or try to get both sides together. Turkey has tried it, Israel has tried it, and I think whoever is willing to do this, we should encourage them. And India's voice is important. It should be heard more.
Right. Thank you very much for putting into context for us, Ambassador Pankaj Saran. We've run out of time, but this is a story that we continue to follow very, very closely, and clearly things are likely to escalate on the Ukraine-Russia war front. We're going to take a short break, but coming up on the other side, Italy will be going to polls as it elects a new government. A special discussion with author David Broder when we return. Welcome back. You are watching Global Eye. Let's now shift our focus to another European nation, Italy, that would be going to polls on Sunday as it elects a new government. It's 71st in 77 years of post-World War II history. And the polls are anything to go by. There could be a tectonic shift in Italian politics. Brothers of Italy, a far-right party, is expected to emerge the largest party, catapulting its leader, Giorgia Meloni, to the top post. The 45-year-old Meloni, known for her ultra-conservative views, would become the first female prime minister in Italy's history. She would also become the first far-right leader to lead the country since 1922, since the time of dictator Benito Mussolini. And to take this forward, we're now joined by David Broder, author of Mussolini's Grandchildren, Fascism in Contemporary Italy. Mr. Broder, thank you very much for joining us here on Global Eye on CNBC TV 18. Tell us about this shift in Italian politics and the rise of Giorgia Meloni. What does this say about the mood of the electorate?
Well, we've seen the far right become an increasingly important part of Italian politics in the last 30 years. Some of your viewers may know Silvio Berlusconi, who was the center-right leader who came to power in the 1990s. And he brought former fascists into his government, into the coalition for the first time. But what's different this time is that the far right, Giorgia Meloni's party, is going to be the biggest party. And it's doing so on a program of low taxes, but also drastically cutting immigration. It's a party rooted in fascism. It was created by admirers of Mussolini after 1945, after his overthrow and death. And in ways, it's moderated its policy and its tone, but it's very much a party created by people in that tradition. So in that sense, it is a sharp shift to the right for Italy.
Right. How would her view and approach be to the European Union? She has also said the European Union has been complicit about ethnic replacement. There was also a headline in The Economist which said, how afraid should Europe be of Giorgia Meloni? What does this really mean for Italy's ties with the European Union and also with the world?
Well, until a few years ago, Giorgia Meloni did propose that Italy should leave the Eurozone, abandon the single currency. She's often spoken in very critical terms of the leadership of the European Union, saying it was a Soviet-style bureaucracy. As you rightly say, she said that it was planning the ethnic replacement of white Europeans by Africans and Muslims, and adopted this very conspiracy theorist attitude. Recently, she's changed that a lot and very much emphasized her loyalty to the European Union, to NATO, saying in Europe she wants to change the immigration policy, but not to leave, not to split. And also she's committed a lot to arms supplies for Ukraine and support for the Ukrainian side rather than the Russian. So these are ways in which she's tried to mainstream her image, but also there's big contradictions. So in Europe, she's mainly allied to governments like Viktor Orban in Hungary and Law and Justice, the ruling party in Poland, who basically want to turn Europe away from accepting immigrants, who want to reject abortion, who want to push back against gay rights and against this kind of civil liberties. So I'd expect that she'll change the sort of civil liberties agenda in Europe a lot, but without actually seeking to leave the European Union or anything like that. Of course, the question is how her government would hold on faced with the growing energy crisis.
Right. And give us a sense of the economic mood in Italy, which may have given rise to her popularity and some of her economic priorities, some of her promises, which may be clicking with the voters in Italy.
Well, she's leading a right-wing coalition, also including Silvio Berlusconi's party and the Lega, another hard-right party. And their big message is heavy tax cuts. Italy now has progressive taxation, so the less you earn, the less percentage you pay, and they want to replace that with a flat tax. So they want to radically reduce overall taxation. And they say that they're going to continue with the policy pursued by the outgoing government of Mario Draghi with respect to European recovery funds, after the pandemic, the new investment. But also they want to do things like cut back on spending on the environmental transition. And they also call for a so-called tax peace, which really means less tax inspections, so which is appealing to small businesses. But I think that the problem they face is that, while Meloni is making a big deal about her free market positions, lower tax and so on, because there's such a strong crisis of energy prices and inflation in Europe, I think we could very quickly go into terrain where she'll need to follow a much more interventionist policy. Italy has had more than 20 years of economic stagnation, falling wages. And so although, of course, the right-wing coalition is the strongest, we're also seeing a strong movement in favor of parties who want to boost income support for Italians. And so I think that's also a contradiction in the election we're seeing now.
All right, David, thank you so much for joining us here on Global Eye, putting the Italian election in context for our viewers and the rise of Giorgia Meloni as well. Moving on, there's unrest across Iran with thousands of women taking to the streets to protest against the killing of a 22-year-old woman, Masha Amini. She was beaten to death by the so-called moral police for not wearing the hijab properly. Human rights groups say at least 8 people have been killed so far in the protests. Several videos are surfacing online showing women taking off their hijab. Vivekanand International Foundation. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us here on Global Eye. Let me begin by asking you, what does this mean for the Iranian government and this moment in Iran's history?
Before 1979, Iran had been modernized or westernized quite a bit, as we know, during the Shah's time. And since 1979, when the current dispensation or Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, we have seen that there was a constitution which provided, the Article 20 of 1979 provided equal rights to the women and men both. But over time, it was due to the Sharia implementation that there were several restrictions on the personal liberties of women have been placed. And this has been off and on coming out in the open by way of protests. And we have seen sometimes the women also challenging the authority because they consider it is a religious imposition on their free will. But this time, as a morality police, or as a tabwa, or as it is called, what they have done in the death of this young woman has actually infuriated a very large population of the country. And there are also several other factors. For example, the economic downturn, the problems that are happening due to the pandemic, as well as due to the continuing sanctions. Iran happens to be the second largest sanctioned country in the world after Russia. So there is, of course, there are problems. And that's why President Raisi, in fact, tried to calm it down somehow. But then what we are seeing now is that there's anti-government and pro-government protesters, and there are clashes among them, and they are calling death to this or that. And those are the kind of things, and accusing evil strategy of the enemy, or for that matter, that the revolution's principles will not be defeated, or the values will continue to persist. Now, that is something that is going to not go down with the women, and they're continuing to oppose any imposition and trying to prevail in their own rights. Now, how it will go, we have seen what happened in 2019, and whether it will move forward in that direction, it remains to be seen. But definitely, we are looking at further escalation.
All right. And we had seen Mahsa Amini, there were reports about her being hit by the moral police, her head being banged against a police vehicle as well. The UNHRC has called for an independent inquiry. Now, these global calls for investigation, this global attention, how will this impact the Iranian regime?
Well, I don't see that Iranian regime will at all be scared of these kind of calls for investigations, because, see, they know that they're already under maximum sanctions possible. They've been hoping for the revival of the JCPOA, the new Iran nuclear deal. That is also not moving forward in the right direction. And therefore, anything further, they will be considered as intervention in their internal affairs. And I doubt very much that the Iranian regime at the moment will consider or give any lenient way in this. In fact, if as President Raisi said, that protests are permitted, but riots are not. So there is a very little difference and a razor thin margin when these things go out of hand. So there could be greater violence. But at the moment, of course, I think that if the government does take action against those who are responsible for the death of Amini, I think that there might be some tempers. But then there are deeper roots, deeper causes for this kind of the people's frustration that is coming out of the streets.
All right. Ambassador Trigunayat, thank you very much for joining us about the protests over the killing of a 22-year-old in Iran. And these anti-hijab protests are escalating across the country, and we'll keep an eye out for those as well. Thank you very much for joining us. That really brings us to the image of the week. Veteran CNN journalist Christiane Amanpour sitting in front of an empty chair. This was after Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi cancelled their interview for refusing to wear a headscarf for their meeting in New York. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.